On the morning of July 24, 1944, approximately 8,000 meters above the shimmering blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea, Japanese intelligence officer Captain Takeshi Yamamoto sat in a cramped briefing room in Tokyo, studying reconnaissance photographs with growing confusion. The morning sun filtered through the narrow windows of the intelligence building, casting long shadows across the detailed maps spread before him. The images showed American bomber formations over Europe, escorted by fighter aircraft painted in distinctive red tails. What puzzled Yamamoto was not the aircraft themselves, but the repeated reports from German sources claiming these particular escort pilots demonstrated unusual tactical discipline and an almost supernatural refusal to abandon their charges. The Germans had nicknamed them Red Tail Angels, a term that appeared in report after report with increasing frequency and respect. Yamamoto had spent 3 years analyzing American military capability, attempting to understand the industrial giant that had entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor. He had studied production figures, tactical doctrines, training programs, and personnel policies. He believed he understood American strengths and weaknesses. Their strength was industrial production, their ability to build aircraft and ships faster than they could be destroyed. Their weakness, he had concluded, was the soft individualism of their culture, the lack of spiritual discipline that Japanese military philosophy considered essential to victory. But these red-tailed pilots contradicted his analysis. Report after report described a level of tactical discipline and collective commitment that exceeded even elite German units. They never broke formation to pursue individual targets. They never abandoned their assigned bombers to seek personal glory. They operated with a unity of purpose that seemed almost Japanese in its selflessness. Yamamoto assumed, as did most of the Japanese high command, that these must represent America's absolute elite, perhaps graduates of their most prestigious military academies, the cream of their European immigrant population, men selected from thousands of candidates for their exceptional qualities. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What neither Yamamoto nor his superiors could have imagined was that these pilots, who were systematically destroying the German Air Force's ability to intercept American bombers, represented men that America itself had deemed unfit to fight alongside white soldiers just 2 years earlier. These were not men selected for their exceptional qualities, but men who had been excluded because of the color of their skin. Their success would shatter assumptions held by enemies and allies alike, and ultimately help transform the nation they served, despite its rejection. The story truly begins not in the skies over Europe, but in the hot Alabama sun of 1941, at a newly constructed airfield near Tuskegee. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from the concrete runways, and the red clay dust of Alabama seemed to coat everything it touched. Second Lieutenant Robert Matthews stood at attention in the sweltering heat, his uniform already darkening with perspiration despite the early morning hour. He watched as his flight instructor, a white captain named James Cooper, circled him with barely concealed skepticism, like a prosecutor examining evidence he expected to be fraudulent. Matthews had graduated top of his class from Howard University with a degree in mechanical engineering. He spoke 3 languages fluently: English, French, and German. He had logged more civilian flight hours than most of the white cadets entering primary training. Having worked 2 jobs to afford flying lessons at a small airfield in Maryland, where the owner, a former barnstormer who had flown in the Great War, cared more about a man's ability than his appearance. Matthews had studied aerodynamics, navigation, meteorology, and aircraft systems on his own time, preparing for an opportunity he had been told would never come. Now that it had come, he found himself facing skepticism that felt almost palpable. The Tuskegee Army Airfield had been constructed specifically for this program, a fact that itself revealed the contradictions of segregation. The Army could have simply integrated colored pilots into existing training programs, but that would have required white and colored men to share facilities, to eat in the same mess halls, to sleep in the same barracks. Instead, the military had spent millions of dollars building an entirely separate base, a monument to the inefficiency of prejudice. Captain Cooper stopped directly in front of Matthews, his face impassive, revealing nothing of his thoughts. He was a veteran instructor who had trained hundreds of pilots, but this was his first colored student, and the novelty of the situation seemed to unsettle him. "You understand what you're attempting here, Lieutenant," he said quietly, his voice almost gentle. "The United States Army Air Forces has never trained a colored pilot. Never. Not one. Congress authorized this program under pressure from civil rights organizations and certain politicians, but that doesn't mean anyone expects it to succeed. The prevailing view among senior officers is that this program will demonstrate conclusively that colored Americans lack the aptitude for military aviation." Matthews met his gaze steadily, refusing to let his eyes drop, refusing to show anything but confidence. "I understand perfectly, sir. I understand that I am not here merely to learn to fly military aircraft. I am here to prove that capability has nothing to do with the color of a man's skin. That's precisely why I intend to excel. Adequate performance will not be sufficient. Only excellence will prove what needs to be proven." Cooper's expression shifted slightly, perhaps with respect, perhaps with pity. "Excellence may not be sufficient either, Lieutenant. I've seen the evaluation criteria for this program. The washout standards are higher than for white cadets. The academic requirements are more stringent. The margin for error is essentially zero. Even if you perform as well as the best white cadets, there are officers who will find reasons to fail you." Matthews allowed himself a slight smile. "Then I suppose I will need to perform better than the best white cadets, sir. Significantly better. What Matthews and his fellow cadets in Class 42C didn't know, what they wouldn't learn until decades later when classified documents were finally released, was that their training program had been designed with an expectation of failure built into every aspect of its structure. The washout rate was set at 75%, nearly double that of comparable white pilot training programs. The academic requirements were more stringent. White cadets needed to score 70% on navigation exams to pass. Colored cadets needed 85%. The flight evaluation criteria were more severe. A white cadet could make 3 landing errors before being failed out. A colored cadet was allowed one. The physical training was intentionally grueling, designed to break men down. The academic schedule allowed for minimal sleep. The flight training proceeded at a pace that left no time for review or reflection. Every aspect of the program seemed calculated to create failure, to provide evidence that could be used to justify ending the entire experiment. Major General Henry Arnold himself, the commanding general of the entire Army Air Forces, had stated in a private memorandum that circulated among senior staff that the program existed primarily to quiet civil rights activists, and that he expected it would demonstrate, once and for all, the unsuitability of colored Americans for combat aviation. He had written, with the casual certainty of a man who had never questioned his assumptions, that colored men lacked the reflexes, the spatial reasoning ability, and the emotional discipline required for military flying. The Tuskegee program, in his view, would prove this scientifically, ending the political pressure for integration. But something unexpected happened, something that confounded the predictions and invalidated the assumptions. The men of the Tuskegee program didn't just meet the inflated standards, they exceeded them with a consistency that could not be explained away as statistical anomaly or luck. Matthews completed his primary training with scores that would have placed him in the top 5% of any white training class. His classmate, Lieutenant Benjamin Davis, Jr., the son of the Army's only colored general, and a man who had endured 4 years of complete social isolation at West Point, where no white cadet would speak to him except in the line of duty, flew with a precision that left even skeptical instructors shaking their heads in amazement. Lieutenant Charles Hall demonstrated gunnery scores that exceeded those of almost every white pilot in the entire training command. His ability to track and engage targets while maneuvering his aircraft at high speed was so exceptional that his instructor initially suspected the scoring equipment was malfunctioning. It was not. Hall simply possessed extraordinary hand-eye coordination and an intuitive understanding of deflection shooting that could not be taught. The instructors, many of whom had arrived at Tuskegee expecting to shepherd incompetent students through a doomed program, found themselves confronting an uncomfortable reality. These men were not just competent, they were exceptional. Some instructors responded by raising standards even higher, finding new ways to fail colored cadets who would have passed easily in any white program. Others, to their credit, began to question the assumptions they had carried their entire lives. Captain Cooper fell into the latter category. After 6 weeks of instruction, he submitted a report to his commanding officer that read, in part, "Lieutenant Matthews demonstrates flying ability equal to or exceeding any student pilot I have trained in 12 years as an instructor. His understanding of aerodynamics is superior to that of most of my previous students. His instrument skills are excellent. His judgment under pressure is sound. I can find no objective basis for failing this student, despite being instructed to maintain unusually high standards for colored cadets." By the time Class 42C graduated in March of 1942, they had achieved something no one in the Army Air Forces had thought possible, a completion rate of 60%, higher than many white training classes operating under less stringent standards. The men received their silver wings in a ceremony that was both a triumph and an insult. It was held at the base theater, a modest building that could barely accommodate the graduating class and their families. The ceremony was attended by exactly 0 high-ranking white officers from the Army Air Forces command structure. No generals came, no colonels. The highest-ranking white officer present was a major who served as the base commander's adjutant and who made no secret of his resentment at being assigned to witness the event. But the theater was filled nonetheless. Colored families had traveled from across the country, some riding segregated trains for days, to witness this impossible achievement. Mothers who had worked as domestic servants to pay for their sons' education. Fathers who had endured decades of discrimination to provide opportunities their own fathers could never have imagined. Brothers and sisters, wives and girlfriends, all crowded into that modest theater to see colored men receive the wings that society had declared they could never earn. When Lieutenant Matthews walked across the stage to receive his wings, his mother sat in the front row weeping. She was a school teacher in Philadelphia, a woman who had taught her son that education and excellence were weapons against prejudice. She had saved every letter he had sent from Tuskegee, letters that described the impossible standards, the hostility, the constant pressure. She had sent back letters encouraging him to persist, to prove them wrong, to be excellent because adequate would never be enough. Now she watched him pin those silver wings to his uniform, and for a moment the decades of struggle seemed worthwhile. The military establishment had run out of reasons to deny these men combat deployment, but remained deeply uncertain about how to use them. The solution, typical of the segregated military's tortured logic, was to send them where they could do the least damage to white units' morale, and where their potential failure would be least visible to the American public. The 99th Fighter Squadron, composed entirely of Tuskegee graduates, was designated for deployment to North Africa in April of 1943. The months between graduation and deployment were spent in advanced training, learning to fly combat aircraft and practicing combat tactics. The 99th was equipped with older Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters, aircraft that white squadrons in the European theater had already replaced with more advanced P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. The P-40s were good aircraft, proven and reliable, but they were outclassed by the newest German fighters. Giving them to the 99th was another manifestation of the military's ambivalence. Deploy them to combat as political pressure demanded, but don't give them equipment that might enable them to outshine white units. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr., now commanding the 99th, gathered his pilots in a tent outside Casablanca on the evening before their first combat mission. The air was thick with tension and the distant sound of artillery from the ongoing North African campaign. The tent was illuminated by hurricane lamps that cast dancing shadows on the canvas walls. Outside, the Mediterranean wind carried the smell of salt water and diesel fuel from the ships in the harbor. Davis, whose own father had endured decades of discrimination to reach flag rank, becoming the first colored general in the United States Army, understood better than anyone the weight his men carried. Davis himself carried scars that few of his pilots fully understood. At West Point, he had endured 4 years of complete social isolation, a hazing practice known as silencing, where white cadets refused to speak to him except when required by military duty. He had eaten every meal alone, attended every social function alone, spent 4 years surrounded by people who treated him as invisible. He had graduated in the top third of his class, proving through sheer determination that isolation could not break him. Now at age 30, he commanded men whose success or failure would determine not just their own futures, but the futures of every colored American who hoped to serve in roles beyond those traditionally assigned to them. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and clear, carrying to every man in the crowded tent, "tomorrow we enter combat. Tomorrow we cross a threshold that America believed we would never reach. Tomorrow we become combat pilots in the United States Army Air Forces, a thing that was impossible 3 years ago. But I want you to understand something fundamental, something that goes beyond tactics and training. We are not here simply to fight the enemy. We are here to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. We will face the enemy abroad, and we will face the assumptions of our own nation at home." He paused, looking at each man in turn, making eye contact, ensuring they understood the significance of what he was about to say. "Every mission we fly will be judged not just on its tactical success, but as evidence in a larger argument. There are men in Washington, men with stars on their shoulders and authority over thousands, who have staked their reputations on our failure. They have predicted that we will panic under fire, that we will lack the discipline for formation flying, that we will abandon our charges to pursue personal glory. They want us to fail because our success will force them to question assumptions they have held their entire lives." Lieutenant William Campbell, a quiet pilot from Chicago who had given up a promising career in engineering to join the program, who had endured harassment from white citizens who saw his uniform as an affront to the natural order of things, raised his hand. "Sir, what if we encounter situations where the tactical situation demands we break off escort to pursue enemy fighters? Standard doctrine says that achieving aerial victories helps protect the bombers by reducing enemy fighter strength." "Standard doctrine," Davis interrupted, his voice sharp, "is written by and for white pilots who have the privilege of being judged as individuals. When a white pilot makes a mistake, he's just one pilot who made a mistake. His failure doesn't condemn every white man in America. His poor judgment doesn't become evidence that white people lack the capacity for combat aviation. When any of us makes a mistake, we confirm every stereotype about our race. We will not break escort. We will not abandon our charges. We will not give anyone the opportunity to say that we prioritized personal glory over mission success, that we cared more about our own aerial victories than about the lives of the men we're assigned to protect." He let that sink in, watching the understanding settle onto their faces. "This means we will never have the highest number of aerial victories. White squadrons that chase German fighters across the sky will shoot down more aircraft than we do. They will receive more medals, more publicity, more glory. We are sacrificing personal recognition for collective success. We are accepting that history might remember us as adequate rather than exceptional, because protecting bombers doesn't generate the stories that newspapers love to print." Another pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Freeman from Louisiana, spoke up. "Sir, that seems unfair. Why should we have to fight with one hand tied behind our backs?" Davis smiled grimly. "Because life is unfair, Lieutenant. Because we live in a nation that values white lives more than colored lives, and we have to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. But here's what they don't understand. By refusing to abandon our charges, by demonstrating discipline that white squadrons don't have to maintain, we will prove something more important than our ability to shoot down enemy aircraft. We will prove that colored Americans can be trusted, that we can be disciplined, that we can put mission success above personal glory. And that proof, that evidence, will be undeniable. They can dismiss aerial victories as luck. They cannot dismiss an unblemished record of bomber protection." The tent fell silent. The pilots understood now. They were not just fighter pilots. They were witnesses in a trial, evidence in an argument, pioneers in a struggle that extended far beyond the battlefield. Their performance would determine not just the course of this conflict, but the course of history itself. The next morning, April 19, 1943, the 99th flew their first combat mission. The pilots rose before dawn, their nerves taut with anticipation and anxiety. Breakfast was a quiet affair, men pushing food around their plates, too nervous to eat much despite knowing they would need the calories for the demanding hours ahead. They dressed methodically, checking and rechecking equipment. Flight suits, Mae Wests, parachutes, sidearms, survival kits. Every item was inspected multiple times, hands seeking the reassurance of familiar objects. The P-40s sat in a neat line on the tarmac, their shark-mouth nose art grinning in the pre-dawn darkness. Ground crews had worked through the night, ensuring every aircraft was perfect, understanding that these pilots faced challenges beyond just enemy opposition. The crew chiefs, also colored men who had fought their own battles to serve in their current roles, shook hands with their pilots, offering quiet words of encouragement. The mission was to escort medium bombers to targets in Sicily, attacking coastal fortifications in preparation for the upcoming Allied invasion. Intelligence predicted light opposition. The briefing officer, a white major who made no effort to hide his skepticism about colored pilots, delivered his assessment in a tone that suggested he expected disaster. "The enemy may or may not contest this mission," he said dismissively. "If they do, remember your training and try not to panic." Lieutenant Matthews felt anger flash hot in his chest but suppressed it. Getting angry would accomplish nothing except confirming stereotypes about emotional colored people who couldn't control themselves. Instead, he focused on the mission details. Altitude, headings, radio frequencies, rendezvous points. He committed every detail to memory, knowing that any failure would be magnified, any success minimized. The takeoff went smoothly, 12 P-40s lifting into the morning sky in perfect formation. Matthews flew in the second flight, maintaining precise position off his flight leader's wing. The formation tightened as they climbed, each pilot working to stay exactly where doctrine demanded. The Mediterranean stretched below them, an endless expanse of blue water dotted with whitecaps. The morning sun painted the clouds golden orange. They rendezvoused with the bombers over the coast, 12 B-25 Mitchells that looked vulnerable and precious. The bomber crews watched the fighter escort form up around them and probably wondered if these colored pilots could be trusted. Some might have requested different escorts and been denied. Others might have been curious, willing to judge based on performance rather than prejudice. Either way, their lives were now in the hands of men they had probably never expected to fly beside. The flight to Sicily was uneventful, the formation proceeding exactly as briefed. No enemy aircraft appeared. The bombers reached their targets, delivered their ordnance and turned for home. The 99th maintained position throughout, never wavering, never breaking formation. When they landed back at base, the bombers touched down without a single aircraft damaged, without a single crewman injured. It was an unremarkable mission in tactical terms, the kind of routine operation that happened dozens of times every day across every theater of the conflict. But it was remarkable in historical terms because it represented something unprecedented. Colored American military pilots had flown a combat mission, had carried out their duties exactly as required, had protected their charges successfully. It was the first mission of what would eventually become a perfect record, though no one knew that yet. Across the Atlantic in Washington, D.C., War Department officials received the report with barely concealed disappointment. The mission had been monitored closely by senior staff who had half expected, perhaps even hoped for, a disaster that would justify ending the expensive and politically controversial program. They had prepared statements explaining why the Tuskegee experiment had failed, why it demonstrated the wisdom of maintaining segregation in military ranks, why colored Americans were not suited for the demanding role of combat aviation. Those statements remained undelivered, filed away for potential future use. Instead, they got competence, frustrating, undeniable competence. The mission report contained no errors, no deviations from procedure, no evidence of confusion or panic. The bombers had been protected exactly as required. The formation had been maintained precisely. The mission had been carried out flawlessly. There was nothing to criticize, nothing to use as justification for disbanding the squadron. The officials found themselves in the awkward position of having to acknowledge success they had not wanted and had not expected. The real test came 2 months later, over the Mediterranean. The 99th had been assigned to escort 12 B-25 Mitchell bombers attacking harbor facilities in Sicily. Intelligence predicted light opposition, Intelligence was wrong. Lieutenant Matthews found himself leading the second flight when the German fighters appeared, a full squadron of Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving out of the sun in a textbook attack pattern. His radio crackled with urgent calls. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Multiple fighters inbound. They're going for the bombers." Every instinct Matthews had, every hour of training, every tactical manual he'd studied, screamed at him to turn into the attack, to meet the enemy fighters head-on. A white squadron would have done exactly that. It was standard procedure. But Matthews remembered Davis's words. He remembered what they represented. He remembered that 12 bomber crews were depending on him not to chase glory. "Hold formation," Matthews commanded, his voice cutting through the radio chatter. "Maintain escort position. Engage only threats to the bombers." The German fighters screamed past, firing, then pulled up for another pass. Matthews's flight maneuvered their Warhawks into defensive positions around the bombers, close enough that the German fighters couldn't attack without risking collision. It was brilliantly faced severe consequences, tactically sound, and resulted in 0 bomber losses. It also meant the 99th didn't record a single aerial victory that day. When they landed, Matthews expected commendation. Instead, he and his fellow pilots found themselves subjected to an investigation. White bomber crews had reported that their colored escorts had failed to engage the enemy aggressively and had shown reluctance to pursue enemy fighters. The implication was clear: cowardice. The report made its way up the chain of command, eventually landing on the desk of General Arnold himself. Here finally was the evidence he'd been waiting for. A recommendation was drafted to withdraw the 99th from combat and return them to the United States for additional training. The Tuskegee experiment was about to be declared a failure. But then something unexpected happened. The bomber crews who had filed the initial reports learned that their escorts were facing disbandment. 12 aircraft commanders, all white men from various parts of America, jointly submitted a second report. This one told a different story. Upon reflection and after discussing tactics with the pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron, the report read, "We have come to understand that their refusal to break escort was not a sign of reluctance to engage, but rather the highest form of mission discipline. They prioritized our safety over personal glory. In 5 subsequent missions with colored escorts, we have not lost a single aircraft to enemy fighters. This is a better record than we achieved with any previous escort squadron. We request that the 99th remain on combat duty." The recommendation to disband was quietly shelved. The 99th continued flying missions, and their record continued to improve. By December of 1943, they had flown over 500 combat missions. Their loss rate was lower than any comparable white squadron. Their bomber protection rate was the highest in the theater. The Pentagon faced a problem. The statistics were undeniable, the success impossible to dismiss. More importantly, bomber crews were specifically requesting colored escorts. This created a political difficulty. If the Tuskegee pilots were good enough to protect white airmen in combat, on what grounds could segregation be justified? The solution was expansion. In January of 1944, the 99th was joined by 3 additional squadrons of Tuskegee graduates, forming the 332nd Fighter Group. They were equipped with newer P-47s and eventually the superb P-51 Mustang. To make them easily identifiable and perhaps to keep them separate from white units, the tails of their aircraft were painted bright red. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, now full colonel and commanding the entire group, instituted the same policy he'd established with the 99th: never abandon the bombers. Never. This single tactical decision would define their entire combat record and ultimately change American military history. Captain William Hasty, civilian aide to the Secretary of War, and one of the few colored men with access to high-level military planning, was present in a meeting in March 1944 when a general casually referred to the 332nd as Davis's colored boys. Hasty, who had endured similar condescension for months, chose this moment to speak. "General," he said quietly, "those colored boys have escorted 679 bomber missions and have not lost a single aircraft to enemy fighters. Not one. That is a record unmatched by any white fighter group in any theater of this conflict. Perhaps we should consider what that suggests about the capability of colored Americans in all military roles. The room went silent. The general stared at Hasty, then at the statistical reports in front of him. He couldn't dispute the numbers. No one could. By June of 1944, the reputation of the Red Tails had spread throughout the 8th and 15th Air Forces. Bomber crews traded cigarettes and liquor rations for the privilege of having the 332nd as their escorts. White pilots, many of whom had grown up in segregated communities and had never spoken to a colored person as an equal, found themselves seeking out Red Tail pilots in officer clubs to learn their tactics. Lieutenant Marcus Chen, a Chinese-American bomber pilot from California who faced his own discrimination, wrote in his diary, "Today I met Captain Matthews of the 332nd. He explained their escort philosophy over terrible coffee in the officers' mess. He said something I'll never forget. We stay with you because we understand what it means to be abandoned." I think he was talking about more than just aerial tactics. The turning point in international perception came on July 24, 1944. The mission was a deep penetration raid on an aircraft factory in southern Germany, one of the longest bombing missions of the war. The 332nd was assigned to escort the final leg, the most dangerous portion, when German fighters typically attacked exhausted bomber formations. The German Air Force assembled a massive defensive force, over 100 fighters, including their newest jets. The battle that developed was the largest air engagement the Red Tails had yet encountered. For 45 minutes, they fought a running battle across 200 kilometers of sky, engaging wave after wave of enemy fighters. Captain Earl Lane, leading one of the flights that day, recorded his experience in a report filed after landing. "We faced a numerical superiority of approximately 3-1. Standard tactical doctrine in such circumstances is to engage as many enemy fighters as possible and accept that some will penetrate to the bombers. We rejected this doctrine. We positioned our aircraft as a flying shield between the enemy and our charges. When German fighters attempted to break through, we engaged them directly over the bomber formation, at ranges so close that collision was a constant risk. We accepted this risk. What we would not accept was a single enemy fighter reaching the bombers. The 332nd brought down 12 enemy fighters that day and damaged 17 more. More importantly, all 67 bombers returned safely. When they landed, the bomber crews did something unprecedented. They formed up on the tarmac and saluted the colored pilots as they taxied past. Technical Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a waist gunner from Texas who had grown up believing colored people were inherently inferior, found himself shaking hands with the pilot who had saved his life. "I watched him," Rodriguez later wrote to his wife, "this colored captain, flying his Mustang between our bomber and a German fighter. So close I could see his face through both canopies. He wasn't trying to shoot down the enemy. He was trying to shield us with his own aircraft. That's when I understood. Courage doesn't have a color. Neither does excellence." The German after-action reports from that engagement reached German Air Force High Command in Berlin. They noted the unusual tactical discipline of the red-tailed fighters and their absolute refusal to be drawn away from bomber protection. German fighter doctrine was based on the assumption that American escorts could be baited into individual combat, leaving bombers vulnerable. The Red Tails had rendered this doctrine obsolete. One German pilot, Major Heinrich Schmidt, wrote in his combat diary, "Today we encountered the Red Tail fighters again. We tried every tactic, attacking from the sun, splitting our forces, feinting at the bombers, then targeting the escorts. Nothing worked. These pilots fight with a discipline I have never seen in American forces. They are formidable opponents." These German reports eventually made their way through intelligence channels to Tokyo, where Captain Yamamoto read them with great interest. The Japanese military, like the German, operated under the assumption that America's strength lay in industrial production, not in the quality of individual soldiers. The idea that American pilots could match German technical skill was already concerning. The idea that some American units exceeded German tactical discipline was nearly inconceivable. But Yamamoto was a careful analyst. He began compiling data on the red-tailed squadron. The statistics were remarkable. Over 1,000 bomber escort missions, 0 bombers lost to enemy fighters. A combat loss rate lower than any comparable unit. Aerial victories achieved entirely within the context of defensive operations, never in pursuit of personal glory. In September 1944, Yamamoto submitted a report to his superiors suggesting that the Red-Tailed Squadron represented a significant shift in American military capability. The report was dismissed. His commanding officer, General Nakamura, was explicit in his reasoning. "Captain," the general said, "you are allowing yourself to be impressed by anomalous data. The Americans have vast resources. It is unsurprising that they can field one exceptional unit. This does not change the fundamental reality. American soldiers lack the spiritual discipline of Japanese warriors. They are soft, individualistic, focused on personal survival rather than collective sacrifice." Yamamoto wanted to point out that the red-tailed pilots had demonstrated exactly the opposite. A willingness to sacrifice individual glory for collective success, to accept personal risk to protect others, to maintain discipline under circumstances that would break lesser units. But he was a junior officer, and General Nakamura was not a man who welcomed contradiction. What General Nakamura didn't know, what almost no one in the Japanese military establishment knew, was that the red-tailed pilots were colored Americans, men who had endured discrimination that Japanese propaganda claimed proved American weakness and hypocrisy. If they had understood that the most disciplined, most effective fighter unit in the American Air Forces was composed of men America itself had considered unfit for combat, it would have shattered their entire understanding of American society and military capability. Back in the United States, the success of the Tuskegee Airmen was creating significant political pressure. Eleanor Roosevelt, who had championed the program from the beginning, used their record to push for wider integration of the military. Civil rights organizations pointed to the 332nd as proof that segregation was not only morally wrong, but militarily inefficient. But the most powerful advocates for the Red Tails were the white bomber crews they protected. These men, many from the Deep South, many raised in environments where segregation was unquestioned, returned home telling a different story than the one they'd been taught. Staff Sergeant John Williams from Mississippi wrote to his senator in December 1944, "Sir, I was raised to believe in segregation. My father believed in it. His father believed in it. But I have flown 28 combat missions over Germany, and on every single mission, the men who kept me alive were colored pilots. They were not just competent, they were superior to every other escort squadron I flew with. I cannot, in good conscience, continue to support a system that treats such men as inferior. If they are equal to me in the air where loss makes no distinction of race, then they are equal to me on the ground." Thousands of similar letters poured into congressional offices. The political consensus supporting segregation began to crack, not because of moral arguments, but because of undeniable battlefield performance. By March of 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group had flown over 1,500 combat missions. Their record remained unblemished. Not a single bomber lost to enemy fighters under their escort. They had achieved over 100 aerial victories. 3 of their pilots had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, though notably, none had received the Medal of Honor despite numerous actions that would have earned that decoration for white pilots. Captain Matthews, now a major and squadron commander, sat in the officers' club in Italy one evening, surrounded by white pilots from various bomber groups. The conversation turned to the approaching end of the war in Europe and what would come after. A white captain, slightly drunk, asked the question many were thinking. "What are you fellows going to do when this is over? Think they'll let you keep flying?" Matthews considered his response carefully. "I think," he said slowly, "that we have made it impossible for them to say we cannot fly. Whether they want to admit we can fly is a different question. But the evidence is undeniable. We have proven our capability beyond any reasonable doubt." A bomber pilot from Georgia, a man who had flown 20 missions with Red Tail escorts, spoke up. "If they try to ground you boys, they'll have to answer to every bomber crew in the 8th and 15th Air Forces. We're not going to forget who brought us home." It was a small moment, a brief conversation in a crowded club, But it represented something profound, the beginning of a shift in consciousness that would eventually transform America itself. The final missions of the 332nd Fighter Group were flown in April 1945. By then, the German Air Force was a shattered force, and bomber losses to enemy fighters were rare for all escort squadrons. But the Red Tails maintained their perfect record to the very end. Their last combat mission was flown on April 30th, 1945. They escorted B-17 bombers to a target in northern Italy and returned without incident. The mission was routine, unremarkable, and perfect. When the war in Europe ended on May 8th, the 332nd had compiled a combat record that remained unmatched. 1,578 missions, 952 fighter escort missions, 112 aerial victories, and 0 bombers lost to enemy fighters. 0. The statistical analysis done by the War Department after the war concluded that bomber formations escorted by the 332nd had a survival rate approximately 15% higher than the average for all other escort squadrons. Over the course of the war, this meant that approximately 300 bombers and 3,000 aircrew members survived, who would statistically have been expected to perish. But numbers alone cannot capture the full significance of what the Tuskegee Airmen achieved. They had entered a military that doubted their capability, fought for a nation that questioned their humanity, and proven themselves superior by any measure that matters. In Tokyo, Captain Yamamoto learned the truth about the Red-Tailed Squadron in June of 1945 from a captured American publication. He sat in his office, reading the article about the Tuskegee Airmen, understanding finally what he had witnessed in those combat reports. These were not America's elite in the traditional sense. They were men America had tried to exclude, who had succeeded despite systematic opposition. He wrote in his personal diary, a document recovered after the war, "I have spent this entire conflict analyzing American military capability, trying to understand the source of their strength. I believed it was industrial production or technological innovation or natural resources. I was wrong. America's true strength, the thing that makes them ultimately invincible, is something we cannot match. They have the capacity, however slowly and reluctantly, to recognize and correct their own failures. They created a program expecting it to fail, and when it succeeded, they allowed that success to challenge their assumptions. We would never do this. We hold to our beliefs regardless of evidence. This is why we will lose." Yamamoto's analysis was prescient. Japan surrendered in August 1945, never having fully understood or appreciated the fundamental nature of American resilience and adaptability. The Tuskegee Airmen returned to an America that was not prepared to honor their service. They faced discrimination in housing, employment, and basic civil rights. Many were denied service in restaurants and hotels. Some were attacked simply for wearing their uniforms in public. The military they had served remained segregated for another 3 years. But something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. Major Matthews returned to Chicago and found himself denied entry to a whites-only restaurant. When the manager refused to seat him, Matthews simply stood there in his uniform, his distinguished flying cross visible on his chest, and waited. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered. Among them were 2 white men who had served as bomber pilots. "That man," one of them told the restaurant manager loudly, "flew 50 combat missions protecting American airmen. He's a better American than you'll ever be. You will serve him, or I will make sure every veteran in this city knows what kind of establishment you run." The manager, faced with the prospect of alienating thousands of potential customers, relented. It was a small victory, but it was the beginning of something larger. The record of the Tuskegee Airmen became a weapon in the fight against segregation. How could America justify denying rights to men who had proven themselves equal or superior in the most demanding circumstances imaginable? The question had no good answer, and increasingly Americans were refusing to accept bad answers. In 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the United States military. The order cited no specific reason, but everyone involved in its drafting knew the truth. The Tuskegee Airmen had made segregated military service intellectually and morally indefensible. Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr., the man who had led the 332nd Fighter Group through the war, became the first colored general in the United States Air Force in 1954. He would eventually achieve 4-star rank, the same rank his father had been denied despite a lifetime of service. The broader impact rippled through American society for decades. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s drew heavily on the example of the Tuskegee Airmen. How could colored Americans be denied the vote when they had proven themselves capable of flying the most advanced aircraft in combat? How could they be excluded from schools and universities when they had mastered complex technical skills under the most demanding circumstances? The arguments for segregation, which had always been weak, became untenable in the face of such evidence. The Tuskegee Airmen had not merely flown aircraft. They had demolished the intellectual foundation of racial discrimination through the simple, undeniable fact of their excellence. In 1995, 50 years after the end of the war, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen were invited to the Pentagon for a ceremony. By then, the Air Force was fully integrated, and colored Americans served at every rank. The ceremony was intended to be a simple recognition, but it became something more. General Ronald Fogelman, Air Force Chief of Staff, addressed the assembled veterans. "Gentlemen, you fought 2 wars simultaneously. You fought our nation's enemies abroad and our nation's prejudices at home. You won both wars. The Air Force you helped create is stronger, more capable, and more just than any fighting force in human history. We owe you not just our thanks, but our very identity as an institution." Among the audience was a young colored woman, Captain Shauna Rochelle Kimbrell, one of the Air Force's first colored female fighter pilots. She had flown combat missions in the Gulf War, commanding aircraft far more advanced than the Mustangs the Tuskegee Airmen had flown. After the ceremony, she approached Major General Matthews, now in his late 70s but still sharp-eyed and straight-backed. "Sir," she said, "I wanted to thank you. Every time I climb into my cockpit, I think about what you and your fellow pilots accomplished. You made it possible for me to serve." Matthews smiled, a genuine expression of satisfaction. "Captain," he replied, "we didn't do it for thanks. We did it because it needed to be done, and because we knew that if we proved ourselves, others would follow. That's all we ever wanted, to open the door for those who came after." The historical impact of the Tuskegee Airmen extends far beyond military aviation. Their success demonstrated a principle that has shaped American progress ever since: that excellence cannot be denied, that capability transcends categories, and that the only real measure of worth is performance. Business schools teach their story as an example of how diverse perspectives improve organizational performance. Military academies study their tactics as examples of discipline and mission focus. Civil rights historians cite their record as the moment when segregation became intellectually indefensible. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the individual lives they touched. The bomber crews who survived because red-tailed fighters refused to abandon their posts went home and raised children, built careers, contributed to their communities. 3,000 men who statistically should have perished instead lived full lives. They had children who had children. The descendants of those saved bomber crews now number in the tens of thousands. In a very real sense, the Tuskegee Airmen did not just protect bombers. They protected futures, families, and possibilities that would never have existed without their exceptional performance. The recognition came slowly, but it came. In 2007, President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen collectively, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. By then, fewer than 300 of the original pilots were still alive, but those who remained stood in the Capitol Rotunda, wearing their original leather flight jackets, and received the recognition they had earned 60 years earlier. The citation read, in part, "The Tuskegee Airmen demonstrated extraordinary heroism, skill, and determination, while serving their country despite facing racial discrimination and segregation. Their achievements paved the way for full integration of the United States military and contributed significantly to the civil rights movement." What the citation could not fully capture was the psychological impact their success had on American society and on America's enemies. When the Japanese military learned that the red-tailed fighters they had come to respect were crewed by men America considered inferior, It shattered their understanding of American society. When German prisoners of war learned the same fact, it forced them to confront the similarities between American segregation and their own racial policies. Most importantly, when white Americans learned that colored pilots had protected their sons, brothers, and fathers with unmatched skill and dedication, it became impossible to maintain the fiction of racial inferiority. The bomber crews who came home told stories that contradicted everything their communities had taught them about race. Those stories, told in American Legion halls and family gatherings across the country, began to change minds one conversation at a time. The last surviving member of the original Tuskegee Airmen class, Second Lieutenant Harold Brown, passed away in 2021 at the age of 101. In his final interview, conducted just weeks before his loss, he was asked what he wanted people to remember about the Tuskegee Airmen. His answer was simple and profound. Remember that we were just men who wanted to serve our country. We were not seeking to be symbols or pioneers. We simply wanted the opportunity to prove we could do the job. When given that opportunity, we showed that excellence has nothing to do with the color of your skin. That's the only legacy that matters. But the legacy extends further than even Brown might have acknowledged. The Tuskegee Airmen demonstrated that systemic barriers to excellence harm not just those who are excluded, but the entire organization that maintains those barriers. The Army Air Forces would have been more effective throughout the war if they had embraced colored pilots from the beginning instead of waiting until 1941 to begin training them. Modern Air Force doctrine acknowledges this explicitly. Training materials cite the Tuskegee Airmen as an example of how prejudice degrades combat effectiveness and how diversity strengthens military capability. It is taught alongside lessons on tactics, strategy, and leadership. The precision bombing campaign that ultimately destroyed Germany's ability to make war would not have been possible without fighter escorts. Those escorts would not have been as effective without the innovations in escort tactics that the 332nd Fighter Group pioneered. Their doctrine of absolute commitment to bomber protection, their refusal to pursue personal glory at the expense of mission success, became standard practice for all escort squadrons. In a very real sense, the Tuskegee Airmen helped win World War II not just through their own actions, but by demonstrating tactical approaches that other squadrons adopted. Their influence on the air war was disproportionate to their numbers. The final irony is that the men who America initially doubted, who Japan assumed must represent America's elite, who Germany feared for their discipline and skill, were simply exceptional Americans who had been given a chance to prove themselves. They were not superhuman. They were not gifted with unusual abilities. They were simply highly motivated individuals who understood that their performance would be judged not just on its own merits, but as a referendum on the capabilities of their entire race. That burden, that enormous weight of representation, would have crushed lesser men. The Tuskegee Airmen carried it with grace, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. They understood that every mission had to be perfect, because anything less would be used as evidence of racial inferiority. So they made every mission perfect. The statistical record speaks for itself. 0 bombers lost to enemy fighters across nearly 1,000 escort missions. But statistics cannot capture the full measure of what was achieved. They flew with the weight of centuries of prejudice on their shoulders and turned that weight into motivation. They faced an enemy in the air and an enemy at home, and they defeated both through the simple, profound power of undeniable excellence. When Japanese intelligence officer Captain Yamamoto finally understood who the red-tailed angels were, he understood something else as well. That America's greatest strength was not its factories or its resources, but its capacity to eventually recognize and utilize all of its human potential, even when doing so contradicted deeply held beliefs. That capacity, more than any weapon or technology, was what made America ultimately invincible. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that excellence cannot be predicted by race, that capability transcends categories, and that the only real measure of worth is performance. These truths, once demonstrated beyond any possible doubt, could not be unlearned. The day Japan realized America's angels had black wings was not a single day but a gradual dawning of understanding that occurred across months and years. It was the accumulation of combat reports, statistical analyses, and undeniable evidence. It was the moment when an enemy's respect for American pilots transformed into a deeper respect for America's capacity to change, to adapt, and to ultimately embrace truths that contradicted comfortable assumptions. In the end, the Tuskegee Airmen did not just protect bombers, they protected an idea that human potential cannot be limited by artificial categories, that excellence will eventually be recognized regardless of the barriers placed in its path, and that those who bet against capability based on prejudice will always, eventually be proven wrong. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.